Now I am shifting to our third panelist, who is not Josef Boroch, who unfortunately could not come, was stuck at the airport in Warsaw. But we have Stephen Jonsy, who kindly agreed to shift panel from the previous one here. But I think the topic is very much related to our discussion here now. Georgia and the Chimera of Europe. Stephen Jones is a professor at Mount Holyoke College in the United States. A very knowledgeable person following the fate of Georgia since the late 70s, who wrote a very recommendable book about Georgia's political history since independence, which really also tests Western concepts, how far they really have to make sense of the Georgian case. We are looking forward to your presentation. This was what I'm trying to somehow. Okay, good. The floor is yours. Thank you.
So, it was very interesting listening to the previous two presentations. And if I may continue the metaphor, I'm a little more pessimistic about the garden, I guess. It seems the garden has some sort of fertilizer has been put on the garden, and it's getting out of control. I'm of course referring to the European garden. I have observations. I don't really have an argument. I haven't done any research on this issue. I've just been thinking about it over the last couple of days and put something together. So you see before you a picture there from the National Geographic magazine, came out last month, and it was suggesting a very different picture of Europe than, as Alessandro pointed out, the rather idealistic vision that Georgians had. Europe, obviously, as we all know, is a very fluid concept. It has changed very dramatically from when the word was first invented around 2,000 years ago by the ancient Greeks, based on a small patch of salty water known as the Aegean Sea. And of course, Europe has transformed and expanded in multiple ways into something that looks very different. It's looked very different over the centuries. Its physical and cultural and historical borders have always been indeterminate, and they still are. We can see also over the centuries massive changes in the demographic face of Europe. In the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a sort of emptying out of Europe, actually. actually, when one thinks about the changes in population in Europe in the 19th century, it was more about emigration than it was about immigration. Now we see a very different picture. For Georgia, I guess that part of the problem for Georgia is, of course, that it's on, as Neil was pointing out, it's an issue of proximity, and Georgia has always been sort of in the far distant horizon of Europe. And in the borders of Europe, I guess, which have always been the least determined, let's put it that way. I'm thinking of the eastern borderlands of Europe. It was significant that when the association agreement was being signed, there was not a great debate, but there was the question about how Georgia would be described. And eventually they decided on the concept of a country in Eastern Europe. In some sense, this has always been a problem for Georgia, and it's in the skirts of Europe. It's on the periphery, and Europeans have never really had a very clear idea about where it actually belongs. So here's a lot of text on the slide. I just wanted to talk a little bit about Georgians' aspirations to be European. I've got two quotations here. I thought I would bring in the First Republic as it's one of the areas I'm studying right now. And you can see from the quote from Mojadania, if you compare it to the quote from Shevardnadze, really there is not much difference. In other words, Georgians, at least from the middle of the 19th century, as Malthouse pointed out, and Malthouse shifted it back a little earlier, have had this sense, this aspiration that they wanted to be, not necessarily join Europe, but certainly they wanted to be a member of the European family. Georgia has always had very tenuous relationships with Europe, of course. You could argue that it had significant relations with Europe during the Byzantium period. Of course, it was a different type of Europe. It was not the sort of Europe that Georgians think about today. The Eastern Roman Empire, if you like, of Byzantium. And also, after the fall of Constantinople, for many centuries, Georgia was significantly isolated from Central and Western Europe. Russia, and again this is referencing Malthouse, of course, becomes a very important conduit of European ideas in the 19th century for Georgians, and this is when we see the rise of the Tek Daliulevi, those educated Georgians who crossed the river Terek and were educated and brought back European ideas to Georgia. And I guess these were the intelligentsia in Georgia at this time were the strongest advocates for the idea of Georgia's Europeanness. Ilya Chavchavadze had a portrait of Garibaldi on his wall in his study. And in 1864 he writes this very interesting piece, Mogzalovi Serelevi, or Letters of a Traveller, in which he not only makes the claim for Georgia's Europeanness, but he's beginning to make the claim for Georgia's difference from Russia. And in some case, a sense that Georgia, in fact, may be actually more European than Russia. With the arrival of Bolshevism, again, isolation from Europe, but what I think we saw in the 20th century under Soviet communism was actually in many ways a reinforcement of Georgia's sense of identity with Europe. Bolshevism was, after all, in many ways, it was a European ideology and brought with it the idea of progress, of materialism, of an atheistic, secular type civilization. And these are all elements that, in many ways, reinforced Georgians' identity with the secular civilization of Europe. Okay. So, again, going back to what Alessandro said, Georgians have a very idealistic view. When I say Georgians, I want to make it clear that, of course, among Georgians there are many different viewpoints about what Europe represents. If you look at statistical surveys of Georgian responses to what Europe is, you'll see very different understandings depending on whether the person being talked to is from an urban area or a rural area, or whether the person is an ethnic minority in Georgia. Very different understandings. So I'm making some generalization here about what Georgians think, but overall, there is this identification with Europe as a beacon of secular civilizations, something invented by through the ideas of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. Europe too as a center of Christendom. And of course, what Neil was talking about, Europe as a member of the European Union and NATO, a Europe that's going to bring security, peace, and economic prosperity to Georgia. And finally, this idea of Europe as a democracy, this idea that Georgia shares the distinct values of Europe in contrast to Russia in particular. But of course there is another Europe out there. And this is essentially what I wanted to talk about. Europe has always been it's always been contested in terms of what it represents. So for example, if we were looking at Europe in the 19th century or in the mid-20th century, we'd have very different ideas of what Europe is. In fact, for most of its history, Europe has not been the vision that Georgians have of this peaceful and secure place. Of course, for most of its history, it's been a land of conflict and war. And that's not a past that has been completely eliminated. This is something that's very present in Europe today when one thinks about the wars in the Balkans in the 1990s, or the ease with which sometimes people in Europe can be mobilized for war. I'm thinking of the British case when the war was fought in the Falklands, where the patriotic mobilization was really quite an effective and easy thing to do for the British government. So it is a place of democratic values, but underneath it, there are many different undercurrents, and one of them is this problem of conflict and ethno-national feelings as well as democratic feelings. It's also a land in many ways of illiberal parties, not liberal parties, but illiberal parties. And this is, I guess, where Europe in some senses is what Europe is now struggling with, partly because of the crisis of immigration in Europe, but clearly there is significant potential in Europe for the development of a very different type of politics, one that is based on ethno-national ideas, on the ideas of national sovereignty, on the old ideas, if you like, of the sort of the clerical forces of the 19th and early 20th century in Europe. A much more traditional, much more conservative approach. It's also a land of populist nationalism and vulnerable minorities. And also, as has been pointed out, it's a land of sovereign states where European identity is quite known. And it seems also it's a land where the meaning and norms of a single European Union have become unsettled by enlargement. I wouldn't argue that the cultural strains between Eastern and Western Europe are very clear, but we can see certainly different approaches and different visions from, let's say, countries that are more towards the eastern end of Europe. I'm thinking in particular of the ideas that are coming from Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland. So, is the Georgian? So the question is the Georgians imagined Europe the real one, or is it the only one, or is it even the future one? So if Georgia is to return to Europe, what is the sort of Europe that Georgia will return to? Is it a Europe where we're going to see perhaps, and I think there's possibly a real danger of this, the agenda of many European parties, should they come to power, is one of a referendum to follow the British example. So what we might see in the future, this is the Europe that Georgia might face, is one where the normative power that Neil was talking about may no longer exist, and we will have a Europe rather of sovereign states largely pursuing their own interests. There are friends of Georgia in Europe, of course, but there are also friends of Vladimir Putin, and it seems many Europeans simply cannot decide how they should deal with Russia. As Donald Tusk put it at the Riga summit in May 2015, there are friends and enemies and skeptics of the European vision that Georgia has. So, so the paradox is that if the landscape in Europe significantly changes, and I think there is a real possibility it may, then in some sense the security problems for Georgia might be coming actually from the problems for the security issues might be coming from the west as well as from the north. The problem is, for Georgia, I guess, is that should this future political landscape, where the normative power of Europe declines, then Georgia is going to find itself in significant difficulty. One of the features, I guess, of normative power in the European Union is something that is generally very important for smaller states, in the sense that this sort of power which stresses international law and protection of sovereign rights for small countries, among other things, this is the sort of power that Georgia needs. If those ideas of normative power are reduced or weakened, as is a significant possibility, I believe, in the future of Europe, then it's going to present new vulnerabilities for Georgia. And of course, if we do see a retreat into the sort of more conservative Europe that I'm talking about, then it's going to leave Georgia out in the cold, vulnerable, I would argue, considerable pressure from Russia and I wouldn't say reincorporation, but certainly some greater influence of Russia in the South Caucasus. Okay. So right now, and I'm finishing on this page, Georgia, it seems, is struggling not with one Europe, but with maybe 2 or 3 Europes. The first is the Europe of modernity and democracy. The second that I've been talking about, one of conservatism and particularism. And a third one that has emerged, and it's, I guess, a bit of a surprise for Georgia, and the idea of diversity and multiculturalism. Georgia is becoming in many ways a country that is beginning to attract immigrants too. So if you walk along David Amajanavelli, you're seeing a very interesting picture of change that Georgia has to deal with. So my conclusion would be that Georgia's best path to survival is, of course, to promote the concept of modernity and democracy in Georgia, because that is the vision of the normative power of Europe, and that's the one that's going to ensure greater security for Georgia. However, thinking about the conservative vision that I've been talking about, what I was trying to establish was that in many ways this is not an anti-European vision, it's part of the European history. And in many ways this vision is closer to the Georgian experience. But that path clearly is one that is going to be ultimately detrimental to Georgia and its ability to exercise its sovereign power. So I think that's all I want to say. Thank you.